I guess we will just start with a short presentation and short announcement that we have 2 working languages today and we have simultaneous interpretation provided. If need be, you are welcome to use headsets. And when we start our discussion, it's really important that you use microphone, otherwise interpreter won't hear you and won't be able to interpret. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, all dear fellow participants. I'm pleased to see that many participants here. Today we have very honorable event and very honorable guest who we are hosting. Today, this is Marcy Shore. I'd like to start with what people normally finish the event. This is expressing my gratitude to Marcy because she came here for as mere as only 2 days. She arrived Friday afternoon and she came to share her plans, her project, and her schedule is very intense. Still, she kindly accepted our offer and she came here to meet you. There are so many people here who are eager to meet you. I'd like to make a short introduction of Marcy and say a few words about her books, and then we will start our discussion. So, welcome our American researcher, professor of Yale University, who teaches intellectual and cultural history. Marcy started her acquaintance with Eastern and Central Europe in early 90s, and since that time the world has seen a couple of books published by Marcy. Those books are well known, they are read, they are being discussed. All the works that Marcy worked on, they are out of her own experience and they are very easy to read, interesting to read, they are grasping. Marcy raises very important issues and these books are of vital importance to intellectual community of Ukraine and the world. We have all the books that Marcy has written, and today she also brought a couple more in translation. The first book that was published, this is Caviar and Ashes, Warsaw Generations, Life and Death in Marxism, which was published in 2006, and it was awarded with numerous rewards. We have this book in English and in Polish translation. Another book which was published last year, 2013, that is The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. We also have it both in English and in Polish languages, and Marcy kindly brought us a translation of this book into German. Also in Poland, there was published the book of articles and essays about modernity. Today, we will have a chance to talk about these books and also about Marcy's experience of Eastern Central Europe after the collapse of communism, about our common experience. We will have a chance to discuss things. We are going to have an interactive talk, so Marcy will be leading the discussion, but you are welcome to express your opinions, to provide comments, feedback, reflections, so that we have a dialogue. I would like to divide our event into 3 parts and start with discussion the first part of Marcy's book, the book with which Marcy claimed to be quite serious researcher, and this is her first research that was a starting point of a journey to East and Central Europe. Later we will move on to a broader context of post-socialist and post-communist Europe. And I believe that not only Marcy will have some comments, ideas, opinions, but also you will replenish the dialogue. Speaking of post-communist and post-socialist Europe and the strong link with the past, with the totalitarian past, I believe that we will definitely speak of the events in Ukraine that were taking place in the past few months in Ukraine, and I'd ask Marcy later on to comment on her real motive, the real motive of her visit, because Marcy also has some agenda why she visited Ukraine. This is also related to our revolution. And Marcy will talk about the role of historian and intellectual in these events. I believe that this is very important thing. So we will start with Marcy's first book, Caviar and Ashes, the book that was awarded with 8 rewards, the book which was of great interest to academic community, the experts from Eastern and Central Europe, and it received good reviews, positive reviews. That is the book that brought Polish society, that brought this topic of Marxism back to Polish society and made Polish society discuss this issue all over again. To me, this book is a good example of collective biography which might provide answers to broader questions. In this very moment, at this very open moment, I'd like to answer the question, what is Marxism to Europe? And the answer to this question is very important, because Marxism and understanding of Marxism is very important to understand what was going on in Europe in the 20th century. That's why I believe that this is the key idea of this book, the red thread of this book. And Marcy has a very special style of writing. With her characters, with the help of her characters, Marcy feels Marxism and experiences Marxism. By reading the book, you experience this phenomenon yourself, and this is fantastic experience. By reading this book, this Marxism environment became more understandable to me. First of all, these are people who hesitate, who doubt, who take decisions, people who change under the influence of both internal and external factors. This is a very complicated history of complicated fates, and the fate of those intellectuals is a kind of mirror of the fate of Europe of the 20th century. And I think that her book can cast light to a lot of things. That's why we would like to start with this book, and I'd like to ask Marcy to talk about the book, the ideas of this book. Also, I would like to ask you, how exactly did you come to this idea of writing such a book? How did you come to writing this book? Because by reading this book and reading your follow-up book, your next book, it's understandable why this topic is important for you. Yeah, owing to your books, I understood this, but when you started your research in the 90s, I think it was not that obvious. So it's about your choice, why you did it, and about your book.
Well, first, thank you all so much for coming. I'm very flattered to see you all here. I hadn't expected this. This was a very last-minute trip, and then this was a still more last-minute presentation. So I'm very touched that you're all here. In fact, I should mention that I came to Lviv rather so that people here could talk to me as opposed to my talking to you. But I'm happy to talk to you in any case. The story of how I came to my first book is a little bit messy, the way I suppose lots of stories about how people came to their book projects is. And the short version of that story is that I was at a very impressionable age in 1989. I was 17 when the Berlin Wall fell, and I knew nothing about communism then. I mean, truly nothing. I didn't realize how nothing it was until later. But I was from the last generation in the United States to be truly a kind of child of the Cold War. So I had a certain worldview that I think was not just my worldview, that was the worldview we all grew up with, in that there was an Iron Curtain, and everything behind it was dark and locked away and could never be penetrated, and perhaps, someday there would be a nuclear war and that would be the end of the world. And then one day it was over. One day, from one day to the next, that world that I thought was just the world I lived in, that was no longer the world that I lived in. So that was extremely seductive to a teenager. And so I immediately wanted to go. I don't even know where I wanted to go. I wanted to go to Berlin, I wanted to go to Prague, I wanted to go somewhere. Simply because it was possible. There was the seduction of something that had been closed opening. And because there was an opening, it felt very compelling. And so when I first went to post-communist Europe, I was a student. By that time, I was a university student. It was 1993. I had been very caught up in the romance of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia in particular, I would say for the somewhat contingent reason that at that time Václav Havel was very widely and very well translated by Paul Wilson. Paul Wilson, who some of you may know, has his own story. He's a Canadian who went to Czechoslovakia in the 1960s and stayed and became the singer for the underground rock band Plastic People of the Universe. And when they all get themselves arrested in 1976, Paul is deported and he goes back to Canada, and he embarks on a career as a translator of Czech literature. And Paul is Havel's translator. And Paul is an extraordinarily good translator. I later, once I learned Czech, I came to realize that there was a bit in Paul's translations. Kundera likes to say, Milan Kundera, and I think he actually stole this from Pasternak, Čekledanie jako žena, může být krásná nebo věrná. That translation is like a woman. She can be either beautiful or faithful, perhaps reflective of Kundera's general attitude towards women. But Paul's translations of Havel were very, very beautiful. And those translations were very important because they made Havel a voice in the West in the way that other writers were not a voice in the West because they were not translated that way. And so I decided when I was a student that I wanted to go to former Czechoslovakia, and I wanted to write about the philosophy of Václav Havel and the Czechoslovak dissidents. And, of course, like all stories, I get there and I discover that the story I thought I wanted to tell was not the real story, or it was not the story I was going to tell, and that of course, the circles of people around Havel were much more divided and full of many more internal tensions than I had realized. But one of those tensions in particular, becomes the source of the first book, and that's that I realized very slowly that many of those dissidents and emigres around Charter 77 in the 70s and 80s had still earlier in the 1960s been the revisionist communist, the reform Marxist hoping for a socialism with a human face. That precisely was Milan Kundera's generation, the generation of people like Kundera and Kohut and Lustig and Mlynář, Vaculík, Karel Kosík, some of you may know these writers. And then still later I realized that many of these same dissidents of the 70s and 80s who had been the revisionist Marxist of the 60s had still earlier been the young Stalinist of the late 40s and the 50s. So I became fascinated with this kind of generational trajectory and with the idea of a kind of generation in revolt against itself and in its own past. And in attempting to kind of understand that Czech, to some extent Czech and Slovak generation, I realized that those people who were born in the 20s, like Kundera and Kosik, who came to communism when it was already Stalinism, and came to communism through their experiences in the Second World War. And that you couldn't really understand. So my first revelation was you can't really understand what dissent meant in the 70s and 80s without understanding what revisionist Marxism meant. And then I realized that you can't really understand what revisionist Marxism meant unless you understand what Stalinism was. And then I realized I couldn't really understand what Stalinism was unless I understood the experience of the Second World War. And so this classic infinite regression problem that historians have, and that in order to understand one moment you have to keep going back and back and back. And then, so then at a certain point, years are now passing, of course, in my life, I thought, well, if I really want to understand the Stalinist experience, I have to understand the Second World War. And at that point, I thought, if I really want to understand the Second World War, I shouldn't be in Prague anymore, I should be in Warsaw, because why be on the periphery when you could be in the center? So having then invested all this time in learning Czech, I then went to Warsaw and decided I was going to learn Polish. And I was young and I had a lot of time. And so I actually did this. This happened. I spent quite a bit of time in Poland in the 1990s when, I don't know if they did this here, but in Poland in the 1990s there was this trend for people doing marketing surveys on the street to just ask passersby to please come inside for 15 minutes and answer these questions about, what kind of cake you want to bake at home or what kind of cookies you buy at the store. And they give you no incentive to do this. They don't offer you money, or they don't even really necessarily offer you the cookies. They just, stop people on the street and ask you to come in and do the survey. And I don't know why anybody did it, except for me, because I was alone in Warsaw in the 1990s. I didn't know a single person when I first got there. I had no contacts, I had no family, I had no friends, I had absolutely nobody. And I was trying to learn Polish, but of course I had nobody to talk to. So I did all these marketing surveys. I think some of them I did a few times. I did them enthusiastically. I got into long conversations with the people, and sometimes I found myself doing a survey for something and I didn't really know what it was for. At one point I was doing a survey. It turned out to be about budyń. It's pudding. I don't know what that would be in Ukrainian. It's budyń in Polish. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And they were asking me all these questions about, what budyń do you buy and how do you make? And I said, can you explain what it is? And they said, well, it's when you cook milk. And I said, but why would you cook milk? You don't need to cook milk, In any case, this is how I eventually learned Polish. And then as I was trying to understand this moment then between the Second World War and the onset of Stalinism, this moment of the experiences of Nazism and the experiences of Stalinism somehow coming together. Like, I had an intuition that the critical thing to understand was how those experiences came together and interacted with one another. And I got very interested in relationships among individuals around this time, towards the end of the war, just immediate post-war period. And at a certain point I realized that in order to understand these post-war relationships, I really had to understand the pre-war relationships, because how these debates and these arguments among communist and Zionist and Bundist and socialist were playing out, 1945 or 46 or 47, I really needed to understand what the 1930s were about and what the 1920s were about. And so I kind of kept going back in time. And eventually I became increasingly preoccupied with the circle of people, the circle of futurist poets, who end up being the subject of my first book, who were born around 1900, who were the futurist and the Dadaist, the avant-garde poets of the early 1920s, who become the radical Marxist of the late 1920s. And that generation was particularly interesting to me because they make a choice for Marxism often before it's Stalinism. And at a time when the Communist Party in Poland is illegal. So they understand that they are probably going to go to prison. And so it's an interesting circle of people because there was very little space for opportunism. They can't be discarded, or dismissed as having made choices for personal gain in some kind of material sense. And so one had to look for more existential, aesthetic, psychological reasons. And I loved writing about poets, I loved reading poetry. And so that then became the topic of my first book, this particularly compelling story of this generation, which is a very, very sad story. And the short version of the story of people like Alexander Watt and Bruno Jastrzębski and even Władysław Broniewski, people who survive, it ends very, very badly, for all of them. They who are the bright young people in the early 1920s, they will either die in the Holocaust or die in the Stalinist purges or, be burdened with guilt and kill themselves. But one way or the other, it ends badly for all of them, and so it's a very sad book. But I became increasingly interested in wanting to somehow find a point of access for my American readers, and I was always thinking about American readers, into Marxism as a lived experience, what it meant to actually live Marxism, as a writer and as an intellectual in the 20th century, and that there was no simple answer to what that meant, that it was very individual and it was very particular, and that's what I tried to describe in this book.
What is important for me in this book is that it ruined certain stereotypes of mine about Marxism that is stereotypically perceived either with plus sign or minus sign. And the environment which you described using this method of collective biography proves that there is a broad spectrum and range of various voices. This is not something monotonous, this is not something homogeneous, which was my stereotypical understanding of Marxism. This is very complex and complicated phenomenon, Marxism, which has to be lived through, it has to be understood, and it might provide some answers to what was going on in Europe in the 20th century. And for me, it is interesting to know how this book was perceived in Poland, because it was translated into Polish in 2008, is that right? And at that time, 2008, if we talk about political preferences and what was going on in Poland, so in 2008, Poland was quite conservative and the environment was quite conservative, and there are definitely young and ambitious people, and there is a representative of left wing in Poland, and these young people they are always eager to criticize the right wing, and I believe that neither environment, left wing or right wing, so the image which you try to describe, they were not completely content with this image, because for the right wing, the Marxism had some kind of human face. Wanda Wasilewska was a woman, the woman who was suffering, who was hesitating, who experienced hard life. But for the left wing people, you tried to show this transformation and transition from admiring Marxism and the clash with Stalinism and this tragedy and this dark side of Marxism. So how did Polish people, different communities in Poland, perceive your book? Because there was discussion in Poland, and I believe that your interviews were published in all major media in Poland, newspapers and journals. So what were the discussions like in Poland, and what were the major moments of acceptance and criticism of your thesis?
That's a very interesting question. Well, first I should say again that I write in English. It's really the only language I write in. I will sometimes translate from other languages into English. I will occasionally give a talk in another language, but I really only write in English. And so I'm thinking of American readers, or I'm thinking of British readers. And when I wrote the book, I felt like the thing that was very important to me as a historian, as a writer, was to write in such a way that my readers would be able to make an imaginative leap into a time and a place where they were not. There was, of course, by the time I was working on this book in the 90s, Marxism was dead. I wasn't writing to Marxist sympathizers. I wasn't writing to people who might want to start up a new socialist party or a new communist party. I wasn't trying to defend Marxism. I was trying to get inside what was so extraordinarily and peculiarly compelling to so many very smart people for so long. What was the source of that peculiar seduction? For me, the most important thing when I'm writing as a historian is that my job is to understand. First and foremost, my job is to understand. My job is to try to put myself in some other time and other place, and in some ways, violate, the minds of the people who live there and try to get inside them, and then try to portray that, as persuasively as I can. And there are a lot of moral risk with that. There's the line between understanding and justifying. I wrote about people who I think were responsible for horrible things. And in some sense, I think I write about them empathetically. Because without that empathy, I felt like there was no possibility of understanding, that I had to try to understand why people did the things that they did. And so that empathy that I always felt was a requirement, or the condition for any kind of historical understanding, I think, is empathy. And that empathy comes always with a risk of moral relativism, and it's an empathy that is always, for a historian, only ever acquired through voyeurism, which is the second moral risk. What you do as a historian is you read other people's letters, you read other people's diaries, you read things that were never ever meant for you to see. You read things that people would cringe if they thought somebody else was going to read. And that's, what the totalitarian regimes tried to do, and certainly what the Stalinist regime tried to do, and what the communist regime tried to do is, try to eavesdrop on people. It tried to invade that private space. You all know this. To try to efface that boundary between public and private, and to try to peer into that private sphere, which was a deep violation. And how, as a historian, then, you write with any empathy is essentially to exploit that violation again. You're peeping through those same cracks, those same holes. You're learning things that you were never supposed to know, in an effort to understand. And so I say, when I wrote this book in English, I was just thinking the whole time about how can I understand, to the extent that it's ever possible to understand another person's experience, and I think there are limits to that. You can never completely get inside somebody else's soul. But to the extent that it's ever possible, can I understand? And then can I convey that? Somehow, can I convey that to people for whom it's a completely foreign world with which they have no contact? And so when I wrote this book, I was writing for people who had never heard the names of these people at all. Nobody, my American readers, by and large, they didn't know who Władysław Broniewski was. They didn't know who Wanda Wasilewska was. They didn't know who Alexander Watt was. I was introducing these people to a readership for the first time. Most of these people I wrote about were very minimally translated or not translated into English. So then when the book came out in Polish, of course, this was this whole other story, which was fascinating for me. And when the reception of the book, I learned so much about Poland, watching the reception of my book in Polish, because, first of all, just the questions I got from journalists. Journalists kept asking me things like, a skąd pani znalazła odwagę, by napisać o Wandzie Wasilewskiej? And where did you find the courage to write about Wanda Wasilewska? And to me, that was a mistaken question, because it required no courage. Really no courage. I like to think it required a little bit of talent, but certainly there was no taboo to overcome. There are millions of people who grew up with these names, for whom the name Wanda Wasilewska has an immediate visceral effect. And in order to say something about Wanda Wasilewska, you would have to then work through years and layers of your feelings and your parents' feelings and your friends' feelings, and I had none of that. She was just a historical character to me. I learned of her existence for the first time when I was a graduate student. So there was nothing to overcome. I used letters in this book that Władysław Broniewski wrote to Janina Broniewska, then Janina Kunig, his fiancée, in the 1920s, which people got very upset about, for various reasons, one of which is that it emerges from this correspondence that at the time of this engagement, there's another woman in Krakow who is pregnant with Broniewski's child, and he tries to blackmail her in this particularly ugly way into having an illegal abortion. And there were a lot of Polish readers who were just outraged. How could I say something like that about Władysław Broniewski? After all, he is one of their great poets, and how did my American readers react to my portrayal of Broniewski? And then I found myself explaining to Polish journalists that my American readers had never ever heard the name Władysław Broniewski before they read my book. He was nothing to the complete blank, tabula rasa. I was writing in English for people who had never heard of any of these people, for the most part. And then I was creating a world for them. Whereas in Poland, it was disrupting perceptions that were deep and personal, and laden with historical and political and philosophical and ideological meaning. And I found that, both people who didn't like the book, said that, well, this is the price we pay for our lack of courage to face these topics ourselves. Some American girl comes along and tells the story her own way. And then, some people who did like the book said, well, what is wrong with us that it's only from this American woman that I find out what our country was really like? And it certainly brought to the fore all that you always have advantages and disadvantages being an outsider. There are things I will never understand the way people on the inside understand. I will never have the ear for Polish poetry that native speakers have. I will always miss things. There will always be layers of meaning, that are lost having come from the outside. And there are also luxuries. There's sort of liberation. I didn't suffer under communism, so I didn't have any sense of taboos. I didn't feel nervous about asking any questions. I didn't feel like there were topics in which I shouldn't pry because they were too sacred, or shouldn't be disrupted because people weren't ready for them yet. Because I was thinking about readers for whom there wasn't any reason to be ready or not ready. Whereas for Poles, there was a feeling that maybe there are some things that our children should deal with that we shouldn't yet have to deal with now. And then one of the stories I then tell in the second book then is the reception of Caviar and Ashes by Krytyka Polityczna, who a lot of you may know is a kind of a very large now, young, left-wing group or movement or salon or publishing house, a post-communist left and really a kind of post-communist left. I mean, a new left in the sense that at its center are people who were too young to have been formed by communism at all, who are both going back to a sort of mid-19th century idea of the Russian intelligentsia, ideas to be lived, who are going back and reading social theory and Marxist social theory of the pre-Leninist variety, and who are simultaneously, in some ways, students of French post-structuralism. Who are they're post-communist left, and they're also kind of post-postmodernist. Who students of postmodernism who want to build something again. And when I first met them, Sławek Sierakowski invited me through my publisher several years ago to give a talk about the book when it first came out in Polish. And the first thing, I was surprised at how many people appeared. And then I was surprised at the questions they were asking me. There were all these people in the room who started asking me things like, so how can we get it right this time? How can we as young intellectuals, engage on behalf of the revolution and do it right? How can we save the world? And I thought, wow, those are excellent questions. But why would you possibly think I had any answers to them? I'm just a historian. I don't have any predictions. If I knew how to save the world, I would happily save it. But in fact, alas, I have no great answers to the great problems of human existence. And certainly none of my American readers had read the book and thought maybe I now have an idea about how the revolution could be done correctly. But I thought, well, what is it that they're seeing in this book that I didn't see, that is making them think that this might help them understand what they want to do in the present? And I was kind of fascinated by that, because it was something in my own book that I didn't see. And at one point, I think for them it was important that I told the story with empathy. They felt like, everything had been condemned, and in an effort not to excuse or not to forgive the unforgivable, nobody had actually tried to understand complicated motivations. And that now they were giving access, or some point of access, to their own past, and were able to grapple with complex motivations. And at a certain point, I said, I'm very happy, of course, that you like my book, but the people I write about, and I think I try to write about them very empathetically, but the people I write about in the book, things turn out very, very badly for them. I'm like, this story is a tragedy. This is not an inspiring story. This is a tragic story. And this bright young man in the front row said, oh, but I didn't read it as a tragedy. I read it as a romance. And that fascinated me.
Maybe your book doesn't provide the answers how to save the world, but I will reiterate that maybe your book doesn't answer the question how to save the world, but maybe it gives some food for thought how to empathize with Marxism, how to understand Marxism. The way you told us about your story, how you came to this book, how you were writing this book. And here we can see your dialogue with the source, your heroes with who you communicate, with who you feel things, with who you go through things, go over things. And I think that here there is a thread which is typical to our Ukrainian geography and history. Actually, you set me thinking that when you love your character, you're trying to find forgiveness and you're trying to understand where is this line where you try to understand and help your character, and the line between when you start loving your character. Because one thing is understanding, the other thing is loving your character. Lots of people say that you were successful in your books because you are not Polish and you didn't experience communism. That's why it was easy for you to write about these things. The question is, would that be easy to write such a book for a person who experienced communism and who would draw the line between yourself and your characters and look in a critical way about what you are writing and what was actually happening? So I invite our listeners, our participants, to give their opinions about this as well. That was my question about this line. How to draw a line between yourself and the character so that you can show this picture in a more realistic color.
That certainly is something I think I grapple with all the time. I think it's something that all writers grapple with. The relationship between you as the author and the character as the character. And there's a necessity to be both close and distant. And there's always a tension, I think, between the need for intimacy in order to say anything of any value, and the need for some kind of critical distance in order to say anything of any value. And I think those two things are always in tension with one another. I mean, I would add that when I've done any translation, and in some sense all the writing I do is translation because everybody I quote, I'm translating. I find a similar tension. And when you're translating, you're trying to penetrate somebody else's voice. You're trying to get inside somebody else's head and see the world as he saw it and express your thoughts the way somebody else expressed them. It's a kind of invasion of somebody else's voice and a wanting to be immersed in somebody else's voice. And in order for translation to work, you have to be totally inside that other voice. You have to let that become your voice. And at the same time, at a certain point, you have to be totally outside it. And you have to take that language and put it completely aside so that you can then recreate it purely in another language without letting, the original language somehow, contaminate the language of the translation. And, for me, those two processes have also always been in tension with one another. I can say that for me, it was a long process of intensive reading where I tried to read myself into the minds and the lives of the people I was writing about. And again, I was a graduate student and I didn't have a family and I had a lot of time. It's something I wonder if now that I have a husband and 2 children, if I will ever be able to do again. I mean, I sat and read and read and read and read. And I read in a kind of very intense way until I really felt like I was inside, to the extent that I could be inside. I felt like I was inside. What was I going to say about being inside? That I had this other thought which I've now just lost. But that attempt to get inside somebody. That attempt to get inside somebody else's voice, I mean, for me, that was the initial imperative. And then when I wrote the first chapter, and I gave it to my dissertation advisor, and he read the first chapter, which is, it's set inside a cafe called Cafe Ziemiańska, in the early 1920s in Warsaw, a literary cafe where the poets went. And the whole chapter really takes place in that cafe. And it was my first draft of the first chapter, and my advisor read it, and he invited me into his office. And he closed the door, and he said, "Okay, Marcy, I'm going to tell you one thing. These people you're writing about, they are crazy. Now your job is to make us believe that you are one of us, explaining them to us. But somehow I read this and I feel like you're right there with them. Yeah. And I remember Norman saying this, he said distance. You need some distance. And so all of the long process of writing that book was a kind of tension between the intimacy and the distance. And I like to think that, and then the moral tension was, besides the tension between empathy and voyeurism, was the tension to empathize without excusing. There was a moment at which my friend Dariusz Stola, who's a Polish historian, and in fact he's now the new director of the Museum for the History of Polish Jews, but he said to me years ago when I was writing about Yakub Berman, who was one of a notorious triumvirate of Stalinist leaders of post-war Poland, who was in charge of both culture and the security apparatus in the bloodiest days of Stalinism. And at one point Dariusz said to me, he said, "Do you know, Marcy, the fact that you have made Yakub Berman so much more human for me makes him only more terrifying." And I was very happy about that, because in a sense that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to affect that empathy and understanding without in any way mitigating or relativizing the horror. For me the trick was to say that yes, there are people who humanly you can understand who will still do things that are horrifying, and there's something fundamental about that in the human condition that was what I was trying to get at. I was trying to make Yakub Berman more human, but I would never want to say that what he did wasn't as bad as we thought. No, it really was, as bad as everyone thought, and probably a bit worse. But to be able to maintain that, to be able to preserve the sense of the horror and the terror, and also preserve a sense of what was human, and what could be understood. I was trying to get at those things simultaneously.
First question, you said that your project started as a fascination with this strange intellectual trajectories of these people from young Stalinists into revisionist communists, but we can certainly somehow trace other intellectual preferences, and some of them became founding fathers of the liberal capitalism in Eastern Europe. Probably you intervened or talked to those people, like, I don't know, Bronislaw Geremek, for example, and how they justify their choices. And second question, some of these dissolutionist Marxists, they immigrated to the West, and they were men of the formidable intellectual power, like Leszek Kołakowski or Czesław Miłosz. But from your story, I somehow, it is not clear how they influenced or not your choice of your so to say interest, or how they influenced your what they meant for you when you choose your topic. I don't know whether it is clear.
Okay, no, those are good questions. The first one I'm probably not really qualified to answer, because I never really investigated the politics of that transition, of the, what it did mean for, some of these former communists to work on the economic side of the transition, which is a whole other kind of fascinating chapter, that moment of transformation. people like Miłosz and Kołakowski, they come into my first book, to the book about Watzergl, in very, I would say, minor roles. You know, Kołakowski has a cameo role in 1966 with a famous speech he gives on Adam Michnik's invitation at Warsaw University on the 10th anniversary of the Polish October. And Miłosz comes into the story largely very late when he interviews Alexander Watt in the 1960s in California. I would say Kołakowski in particular is much more of a central character in my current book project, which is a book I haven't written yet at all, which looks much more explicitly at philosophers, and in particular thinkers who in some ways were connected to the phenomenological movement. It's a bit of a kind of alternative history of Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger as seen from the other side of the Iron Curtain. And so recently, I would say in the past several years, I've been reading a lot of Kołakowski. Although it is true that reading Kołakowski and Miłosz more generally were influences on how I came to the field. You know, when I first, as a student, was trying to understand, you know, what Eastern Europe meant, what Central Europe meant, what it was. Certainly people like Miłosz and Kołakowski, who were also translated widely and translated well, were central. Kołakowski is someone I've only come to appreciate more and more with time. I mean, and he certainly is someone who goes through that generation from the 1920s of being a young Stalinist turned revisionist Marxist turned post-Marxist. You know, and one of the things that's come to interest me increasingly about Kołakowski is the way that he does not go in the postmodernist direction that the philosophical tradition in which he's participating in goes in Western Europe. That he's, you know, once, so let me maybe say this in a way that's more accessible. You know, so if we date revisionist Marxism more or less between 56 and 68, which is a simplification, but let's work with that simplification. After 1968, I think more or less Marxism as a real powerful intellectual, philosophical, you know, force, you know, certainly in communist Europe, I think that was all over. And it was over for Kołakowski. And that death of Marxism as the last grand narrative. I think in the West you see a philosophical trajectory going in a direction in which you then reject grand narratives as such. You reject the idea that there can be some kind of holistic meaning given to our lives, given to history, given to the world. You reject the possibility of something like epistemological certainty, you know, or absolute truth. And for me, Kołakowski was a very poignant voice of somebody who was trying to say that when we give up on grand narratives, we cannot give up on truth because it's a giving up on the possibility of human morality. And after he emigrates, following the so-called anti-Zionist campaign of 1968, in the early 70s at Yale, he gives a series of lectures about the German philosopher Edmund Husserl. And he says, and I won't bore you all with my summary of Husserl's epistemology, but he says basically, Husserl's project fails. You can't, there's no way to get to epistemological certainty, to absolute knowledge. There is no magical bridge between the subject and the object, between immanence and transcendence, between mind and world, between inner and outer. There's no way, ultimately. The problem of the bridge, Kołakowski says, is insoluble. You know, there's no way I can ever completely get outside my consciousness and know that the glass I see is really there. You know, absolute truth, the world doesn't really exist in and of itself. That idea that we can somehow find a bridge from inside ourselves to outside ourselves, that will never happen, because the problem is insoluble. There is no magical bridge. And he says Husserl's project of finding that bridge fails. It fails because all such projects will fail because there is no bridge. But, he says, we have to put outside of our minds the knowledge that there is no bridge, and we must keep looking. You know, because if you give up on absolute truth, if you give up on epistemological certainty, if you give up on thinking there is such a thing as truth, and that you can actually reach it, if you give up on that, you've given up on morality, you've given up on ethics, you know, and therefore we cannot become epistemological relativists. Therefore, we cannot give up on some kind of holistic, all-embracive meaning, even though we know all previous attempts have failed, and probably all future attempts will be bound to fail. We have to put that knowledge aside, and we have to keep trying. And if Rabbi Kolakowski was the most poignant and articulate statement of that position after 1968.
Could you please introduce?
I have a question. What is interesting for me is the difference between being Marxist in Eastern Europe and being Marxist in Western Europe. I don't know if it is in focus of your research. I didn't read your books, unfortunately, as yet. But if you could compare such differences, I mean that in Western Europe, the basic conditions of Western life, modernization, industrialization, were a bit different than in Eastern Europe, and so are these differences somehow influence on being Marxist?
That's an excellent question. It's a huge question. I mean, the first thing we have to decide is at what moment we're trying to answer that question. I mean, certainly there was always the irony or the paradox to the Bolshevik Revolution that, you know, they were carrying out a workers' revolution, you know, in a state that was really a state of peasants. As my friend Amir Viner likes to say, that it wasn't a revolution. It wasn't a revolution of workers. It was a revolution on behalf of workers, and really on behalf of a metaphysical proletariat that had yet to come into existence. And so you have that problem from the beginning. This is not how Marx envisioned it. You know, Marx envisioned that, you know, first we move, you know, to capitalism, and then you have to go through all the stages. But then Lenin comes along, and Lenin is impatient, and Lenin thinks that history can be rushed. I mean, for me, as a historian, Leninism was all about nudging it. You know, yes, history is moving in this direction, but he's a bit impatient and it's going too slowly, so we can nudge it a bit. So you kind of, you know, you leapfrog a little bit. And, you know, of course then, you know, certainly, you know, historians of the Soviet Union who understand this better than I do, you know, will often attribute lots of blame for the kind of draconian kinds of collectivization, the starvation of the peasantry that happens, that's under Stalinism, as an attempt to rush through these stages of history, industrialize at any cost, and catch up because the revolution happened at the wrong moment. But the question about Western European Marxist and East European Marxist, I mean, there was what was happening in the 19th century, what people were thinking about, you know, and then there was what was happening in the First World War, then there was what was happening in the interwar years and in the post-war years, and there are overdetermined reasons. And certainly I think what has become what people have thought about or maybe grappled with most in the past couple decades has been 1968 and the legacy of what happens after 1968, or maybe post-1945. And there's a feeling that it's all well and good for people like, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and their friends, to decide that, that they're Marxist, and they're supportive of the revolution because they don't actually have to suffer. It's all well and good for them to decide that the revolutionary cost imposed on other people and other populations should be borne because they're not costs that are actually imposed upon them because they're not actually living under communism. Therefore, they have a certain luxury to make pronouncements. And there was certainly a sense, I think, among the generation of 1968 in Eastern Europe and in places like Prague and Warsaw, that then the people who then travel abroad or who emigrate after 1968, and they meet their Western counterparts. They meet the people who participated in, May in Paris in 1968, or who were 1968ers in Germany, and they find they don't understand one another because there was still this kind of Marxist revolutionary lyricism in Western Europe in 1968, which from the point of view of people who were living under communism was hardly naive and in some sense insensitive, because they could envision Marxism being anything they wanted it to be, whereas the people who were living through communism in practice were actually suffering. I would maybe tell just a brief story here about my unfortunately no longer living friend, Tony Judt, because this was, Tony, who for me was a very important intellectual voice when I was studying, and I think for many of my friends and colleagues in the States, they would say the same thing. He was of that generation of 1968. He was a British Jew who was in Paris in 1968, who was jumping up and down, shouting Ho Chi Minh, who was part of that revolutionary fervor, who was very much on the left. And I'd say in some sense remained his whole life on the left. And what really changed for Tony was meeting Jan Gross and Irena Grudzinska and Basia Trąček and Alex Smolar in the 1980s, and realizing that precisely at the moment in 1968 when he was in Paris jumping up and down, shouting Ho Chi Minh, the people who were going to become his closest friends later in his life, they were all sitting in communist prison. In fact, of that circle of people he becomes close to in the 1980s, I think literally each one of them was sitting in communist prison in Poland. And the retroactive guilt of that, and the questioning what Marxism meant to him, what Marxism meant to his generation, what Marxism meant to Western Europe, what the left means, that then defined, in some sense, all of the rest of his work and writing. And his most controversial book, Past Imperfect, which was about Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and that circle of fellow traveling French intellectuals in post-war France, is a very, very angry book. It's a vicious condemnation of Sartre. It was received with great controversy. People thought he was way too harsh and completely unfair and extremely judgmental. And to me that book was an extended self-criticism. What he found unforgivable in Sartre is that Sartre does not condemn the show trials during the Stalinist period. When Horakova goes to the gallows, when Slansky goes to the gallows, when Reich goes to the gallows, Sartre and his friends say nothing. Even when Zavish Kalandra, the Czech surrealist fellow traveler and literary critic, who was a personal friend of the French surrealist poet Paul Éluard, even when he is hanged, Paul Éluard refuses to sign a petition by Western intellectuals protesting his execution. And for Tony, this was the betrayal, this was the betrayal of Eastern European intellectuals by West European intellectuals. And that book was an extended self-criticism, and in some sense, I think, was the most poignant attempt to grapple with the meaning of Marxism and the meaning of the left as it existed in relation to Western Europe and Eastern Europe after the Second World War.
Maybe we should move on from the life of communism to the life after communism. And this is second book of Marcy about the taste of ash. So that's the book that shows the other side of Marxism, this dark side. And this book was written through experience, your own experience and experience of those characters who you talk to, who you converse with. And the main thesis of the book is, in order to understand contemporary Eastern Europe, you have to look back. And you have to look back far away from today. And by talking and interviewing children and grandchildren of Stalinists, you talk to people who had to leave and emigrate in the 60s. You talk to people who were Holocaust survivors. This is very personal history, the history of experiencing this past and depicting the present. This is kind of personified Eastern Europe through your histories and your stories. I have quite broad question. What is your Eastern Europe after communism? How do you understand it? How you experience Eastern Europe after communism?
How do I experience it? Well, I'm still experiencing it. I'm constantly experiencing it, and I would say I'm constantly and continually questioning and re-questioning my own assumptions, because life is dynamic and it's in motion and it keeps changing and it keeps surprising me. And certainly the second book was a book I wrote. I say it was a book I began writing in the 1990s, when I began keeping a journal and a file with all the material that I thought was too personal or insufficiently scholarly, and that could not go into a scholarly book. But I felt that there was something essential in some of this material, and there were stories at some point I wanted to tell. And so I began working on it or thinking about it in 1997. And then I hesitated a very long time before I decided to finish the book and to publish it. In part because I felt very guilty about writing it, which is a strange thing for a writer to say, but you know, the book in some sense is a memoir, but it's a memoir in which I'm a very minor character. It's really a book largely about other people I did know and have known and continue to know. In that sense, it's a deeply exploitative book. I thought a lot and I vacillated a lot for years about what material I had a right to use and what material I didn't have a right to use, and what the moral boundaries are about what could be written about and what should not be written about. And there, of course, is no easy answer. To some extent, you know, I waited a long time, and many of the people died. I mean, I was talking to a lot of elderly people when I was working on the research for my first book. I was approaching people, you know, and asking them to give me archival documents, or give me their parents' correspondence, you know, or give me their grandmother's letters, or, and I was asking them about things that were very painful to them, you know, and I was disrupting their lives, and what right had I to do that? And in some cases I was not successful, and people didn't give me things, and in some cases I was. And in some cases I was after an extended period of time, and you know, extended relationships with some of these people in which, for whatever reason, they came to trust me. And so I waited a long time. Some of those people then were no longer alive, and then I didn't agonize so much about whether or not I had a right to use the material. In the end, I changed a lot of names. A lot of the names of the book are pseudonyms. Although I have to say, places like Warsaw are so small that when I was working on the Polish translation with my Polish translator, Marcin Schuster, who's one of the editors of Literatura na Świecie, and there were moments at which, we were working together on something, and I would say, "Oh, Marcin, you know that this character is really so and so." He always knew. It was always transparent to him. In the world, I thought, this wouldn't be true in the States because the U.S. is just so much bigger. Everything is on a bigger scale. But intellectual life in Warsaw is such that everyone was immediately recognizable to Marcin. No matter how discreet I thought I was. And I agonized about it a lot more as I started thinking about the book coming out in Polish. I changed some names. Many names I couldn't change because I was juxtaposing personal conversations with archival material and with published material because many of those people were writers themselves. In the end, I let the major characters censor themselves. I let people cross things out, that I had written about them that they didn't want me to tell. I did that with some ambivalence. I don't know that it was the right thing to do. In some sense, I think it would objectively be a better book if I had left in everything I wanted to leave in. Subjectively, I felt too guilty. I wasn't sure what I had a right to use. There were many people who, when I originally approached them, relationships that began, I harass somebody, I call them up, I say, I'm a graduate student from Stanford University and I would like to talk to you about X. And they know who I am and why I'm talking to them, and then I'm taking notes or that I'm recording the conversation. I certainly never lied about who I was or dissimulated or pretended to be anyone else. But it's also the case that when I was first running around these countries, I was in my 20s and I was a foreigner, and nobody took me seriously. Nobody, especially older men. Nobody took me seriously. So when I would go, it's like it's a 25-year-old American student. If I go to a 65-year-old Polish man and say I'm going to write a book about that, he says, "Oh, that's nice, little girl." And often very generously would talk to me, but perhaps talk to me more openly because I seemed so non-threatening. And then I had to think about whether it was fair of me to exploit that kind of advantage, and not that I ever misrepresented myself. But there were also many cases where, I originally approached somebody, and asked to speak about X, and and explained the reason, and then I simply, then hadn't, came to know that person became one of many people I know and am friendly with, and then there was a series of conversations over a number of years, in which I think, people forgot or it got pushed out of their minds why I had originally come there, and so it wasn't exactly clear to me what I had a right to use and what I didn't have a right to use. So I let people take things out. I think maybe if I had been less cowardly, I wouldn't have done that, but I did. What was the second part of the question? There was a second part.
Just about your experience with issue.
There were some things I wanted to bring out in the book. One of which was the lingering presence of the past that struck me about post-communist Europe so palpably. So Americans have very, very short memories. We have notoriously short memories. Something happened 5 years ago. It's over. We've forgotten about it. There's not. And what overwhelmed me when I was living in Warsaw was, a half a century after the Second World War, you could kind of feel it as if it had happened last year. There was a sense of the past weighing in the present in a different way. I wanted to convey that. I wanted to convey very simplistically that the fall of communism was not a simple kind of happily ever after story, which was how I had originally understood it and the way Americans had originally understood it. in the kind of Francis Fukuyama, the end of history kind of way. The Wicked Witch is dead, and now we all live happily ever after, you know, and we all become liberal Democrats. And that, of course, was not the real story. And it's never the real story in any context, in any country. There's no happily ever after, unfortunately. I wanted to convey something, I mean, secondarily about this relationship between empathy and voyeurism, which as a historian I felt like was an important part of laying bare, you know, the ethics or the ethical problems of the historical process. I also wanted to tell a certain story about tragedy. You know, in Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel has this argument with Kantian morality. I'm going to horrifically simplify it now. And the real philosophers will cringe, but I'm going to do this anyway. I mean, and Hegel essentially says that, you know, Kant's notion of morality is inadequate because it's all about intentions. And the fact is that intentions cannot exhaust the morality of an action because actions not only occasionally, but as a general rule, have consequences in excess of their intent. You know, Hannah Arendt uses this idea, some of you may know this from her book, The Human Condition, you know, when she says that the actor is never the author of his own story, because it's only the historian who can see in retrospect the meaning that the action had. You never see it in real time. It always has consequences that go on. And I wanted to say something about that because that struck me as that felt very real to me, the idea that actions always have consequences in excess of their intent. Also, this idea that there's this famous line from Wisława Szymborska's poem where she writes, you know, Tyle wiemy o sobie, na ile nas sprawdzono. You know, we know ourselves only insofar as we have been tested. And one of the things that struck me as I was trying to get inside the minds of some of these people I was writing about was that time and time again in 20th century Eastern Europe, people found themselves in situations in which there were no innocent choices to be made. You know, in theory, you know, we can say that everyone always has a choice and it's possible to keep your hands clean. But in practice, everyone always has a choice, but sometimes all possible choices cause suffering to someone. Sometimes you find yourself in a situation, you know, in which all possible choices involve a betrayal of someone or something, in which all possible choices involve the suffering of innocent people. Nevertheless, you have to choose. You know, and for me, this was something fundamental about, you know, about the tragedy of the 20th century experience, that people found themselves in situations in which there was no longer a space for keeping one's hands clean because all possible choices involved suffering. And I wanted to tell some kind of story about that. I also really wanted to tell one of the things that struck me in the beginning and continues to strike me now is the role of generations, much more so than in the States. I never felt generational distinctions have the kind of significance that I felt them have in Eastern Europe. And that might be the consequence of moments of extremity, of revolutions. I mean, suddenly the age you were in 1989 made a huge difference. And whether you were 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 made a huge difference. Whether you were just starting university or whether you had already finished university. Those things had a very weighty difference. That and that one of the things I came to understand in Poland as I got to know some of these people, like Kosta Gebert and Adam Michnik and Basia Trunczek, who had been so active in the opposition and active in CLOR and in Solidarity, was that there were all these people who were at the forefront of the opposition who were the children of Stalinists. And there was a kind of collective Oedipal rebellion that was playing out in a particularly dramatic way. You know, and I found that story also fascinating, you know, that this rebellion against one's parents that could never be a simple rebellion, because there was also a kind of guilt by contiguity. a feeling by people born after the war that that ultimately they were always going to be somehow containted or contaminated, or they were always going to bear the sins of their parents. And loving the parents and resenting the parents and feeling a need to create some great act that would maybe write history. One of the conversations I write about in this book is with Kostek Gebert, the journalist who's an underground editor and journalist in the Solidarity days, and continues to be. He was also Poland's most important correspondent in Bosnia during the Yugoslav wars, and continues to be a very important journalist in Poland today. And he was the son of Stalinists, of Polish-Jewish Stalinists, and the fact that they were Jews is very important to Kostek, who also became very active in the rebuilding of the Jewish community. And one of the things he said to me was, everything good in me I have from my parents. And if I devoted, my life to destroying the system that they built, it was because of the values that they taught me. And I wanted to illuminate something about that story, which was a generational story.
Dear Chuck, I have two questions. One is a question/comment, the other is just a question. So can you please explain a little bit more what you meant when you said that there is a lingering presence of the past in Eastern Europe? And I'll have to comment on this a bit, because while I'm a bit worried by this kind of comments, because they can be also interpreted as Eastern Europe is haunted by the past, and especially because you also juxtaposed Eastern Europe with USA when you said that US doesn't have this kind of romance relationship with the past. But these kinds of comments sometimes can be taken to quite a negative extreme. And I don't know if you're aware of the work of anthropologist Jonathan Fabian, who writes about uses of the time for othering, right? And I think that this happens a lot when people write about Eastern Europe and just talk how Eastern Europe is obsessed with the past, with the ghosts, it's haunted. And it's used to construct this image of the Eastern Europe as underdeveloped, unmodern, just simply other, as compared to the West, right? And then, I'm not saying that you have this kind of intentions, but I would like you to explain a little bit more why you have said what you have said, specifically because of these worries that I have. And the other question is maybe even a little bit more overwhelming, sorry. And I just wonder, as a practicing historian, what is your philosophy of history? And in particular, what do you think of the responsibility of the historian? Thanks.
Okay, well, first my comparison between the states. I would say first of all, I do think, as a generalization, the past is much more present here. I would also say that it's not clear to me that's always a bad thing. I think there are certainly moments at which, and I can give you some examples at which I think it's crippling. But there are other, part of my fascination with it was, I think, part of my frustration with the place where I came to, and the short memory that Americans have. And let me give you an example of that. When I was teaching at Indiana University it was 2006 during Hurricane Katrina. I don't know how much that made the news here, but there's a horrible hurricane in the South, and in particular in New Orleans in the United States, which flooded various places, including the city of New Orleans. Dramatically flooded various places, including the city of New Orleans. People who were savvier and had cars and resources and places to go got out. Many people who were poor and less well educated and didn't have resources did not get out. And many of those people fled to a huge stadium in New Orleans, a huge sport stadium in New Orleans. And it was very, very hot. And they were stuck in the stadium for days, and they didn't have food, and they didn't have water, and a kind of anarchy and lawlessness started to reign, and sanitation facilities stopped working, and people started, becoming violent towards one another, and children started dying. And it wasn't as if they were on some island in the middle of the Indian Ocean and nobody knew where they were. We were all watching this on television. And Bush, who was president at the time, he knew where these people were. Everybody knew where they were, and the American government could have gone in, immediately and gotten people out, at least immediately started to evacuate people, or immediately started to fly in by helicopter supplies. And Bush essentially did nothing, and our president did nothing, for a few days. And okay, it was only a few days, but during those few days, people suffered very much, and during those few days, people died. And even in Indiana, which is not, a particularly politically liberal part of the country, and for many of my students who came from these kind of, fortresses of republicanism in small Indiana towns, who were very supportive of the government before, this was a real moral shock. Like the fact that we might kill people in other countries, or the fact that we might be torturing prisoners in Abu Ghraib or doing various sadistic things, that was very far away and vague. But Katrina was a real moral shock. Where I was teaching in Indiana was not that far away. There were students I had who knew people in New Orleans. It was not a foreign world. It was still part of the world that I was living in. And for many of my students, that was a kind of political awakening, and a true moral shock. And that shook people in a way I hadn't seen them shaken before. And then people forgot about it. And it's very rarely spoken about now. For whatever reason in the culture, for whatever reason, because of the ideas on which the country was founded, for whatever kind of momentum, we don't linger on the past the same way. We don't take responsibility for the past in a particularly impressive way. And this is, America is only now starting to have the kinds of serious conversations about slavery, that should have been had 100 or 200 years ago. And so my interest in the presence of the past, I would say it was not because I thought it was necessarily a bad thing or a backwards thing, but I think it struck me because it was so different. And, one can say at certain moments that, works better, and at certain moments that has darker consequences. The responsibility of the historian. That is a tricky question. And that's a responsibility of intellectuals question. And that's certainly something I think about all the time. And I definitely don't feel that there's any easy answer to it, because there are no perfect books. The first responsibility I always feel, and some of the criticism of my book in Poland was that I felt this too much, is that the first responsibility of the historian is to understand. It's an experience of alterity. The past is other. Whether it's in your own country or another country, the past is always other. And there's the moral responsibility of cultivating the ability to make an imaginative leap into another time, in another place, and try to understand somebody else's experience. I think the ability to understand somebody else's experience, even if it can never be done 100%, I think that is a moral responsibility, and I think historians have a moral responsibility to try to do what can never be done completely, but should nonetheless be attempted. I feel a kind of responsibility, and I know that this is a very big question in Ukraine right now, and I know that one of my colleagues at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, where I am at the moment, Volodya, is working on this question, the responsibility of specifically of Ukrainian historians right now. As an American historian of a part of the world that's not America, I always feel a responsibility as a certain kind of cultural interpreter. That I feel like I have a responsibility to make things less foreign, less exotic, as deeply human as possible, to find the ways that will enable people to imagine the parts of the world that they don't know. And to interpret in such a way that I can write in English about things that didn't happen in English, and I can write in such a way that they will become real. That the people I write about will be real people and not just political paradigms or not just instances of an ideology, but that they will actually be real people. And that feels like a very heavy responsibility to me. And I would say that, I'm here in Lviv now, in large part because I've been watching what's happening in Ukraine, even though I'm not an expert in Ukraine. But as someone who writes in English and sometimes has a readership in English, for whom this part of the world doesn't feel particularly foreign or alien to me, I do feel a certain responsibility to play a role as a certain kind of interpreter. And I know that, a couple of years ago when the Arab Spring happened, and I followed very little and I understood very little, but my friends from graduate school who became historians of the Middle East, they felt the same way. They kind of dropped what they were doing, and they felt like, okay, now our job is to understand what's happening in Egypt, to understand what's happening in Syria, and we have to be able then to explain this to Americans who will otherwise understand nothing. And so there's this role of, I think, cultural interpretation that might be peculiar to the fact that I'm a historian of a part of the world that I myself am not from. I would add one thing which I don't know that I'm particularly good at. I had this conversation a couple years ago with Adam Michnik, and we're toying with the idea of my writing a book about Adam's circle and that generation, or really that circle and that generation of 68 in Poland. And I said to Adam very openly, I said that the thing is, to be a historian and write well, you have to write fearlessly. I think the responsibility of a historian is to write fearlessly. And I like to think I can write more or less fearlessly about people who are dead. But I told him very honestly, I said, I don't trust myself to write fearlessly about people who are alive. And if it can't be done fearlessly, it kind of shouldn't be done, because the point is it can only be done well if it's done fearlessly. And Adam's response to that, by the way, was, well, don't worry, by the time you're done writing, we'll be dead. Which is, of course, not very comforting. But I say this, and it's a little bit hypocritical, because, of course, I've just told you that I allowed people to censor themselves in my last book. But in principle, I think that to write well, you have to write fearlessly. You have to not care what people think. You have to... and I know that there were people who read in my book about their parents, about their grandparents, and were hurt. And I did care about that. I like to think I didn't change anything. I'm not conscious of having changed anything, but I can't say I didn't care. And the fact is, I did care. Like, it does weigh on me. And even in a postmodernist world in which we're no longer certain that there's anything like, absolute truth, there is a responsibility, if you're writing, to try to tell the truth as far as you can understand it and to try to do it fearlessly. And that courageousness is an ideal that I don't think I ever completely reach, but I like to think I keep striving for it.
It's not a question about Poland, but about post-Soviet time. Why do you think there is such a huge reason between such countries as Lithuania, Estonia, and Ukraine, for example, in their why influence is different? What's the reason? What affects this influence?
Why different countries are different? Oh, that's a huge question. I would say that it's overdetermined precisely in the sense in which Freud uses that. It's overdetermined in the sense that there are always multiple and overlapping variables at play. One thing I would say is that as a historian, I'm always very wary about making arguments about causality. And that's because there are certain things I think historians can know, and I think Hannah Arendt was right. There are things we can know that the actors themselves could not know. And there's a way in which, as a historian, you kind of get to play God. because you can see what A was writing to B and what B was writing to A, but also what B was writing to C and maybe what C was telling somebody else, and you can actually know more, and more holistically than anybody saw at the time. And so that's a certain advantage we had, that I think you can see things more fully and you can collect sources, in retrospect that you couldn't get at the time. What I don't know that we can ever do is know for sure why things happen the way they did. What social scientists can do, what laboratory scientists can do, what social psychologists do when they're trying to understand, when Stanley Milgram conducts the Eichmann experiment after Eichmann's trial in the 1960s. If you have a laboratory science, you can actually go back and run the same study a second time, holding certain variables constant in the interest of determining, which variables are actually causal, and which are, simply correlated. You can never do that in real life. You can never run a control study on real life. You can never go back and say, okay, we're going to replay this revolutionary moment again, but now we're going to, hold the variable of language constant, and we're going to, we're going to hold the variable of income constant, and we're going to, you never get to do that. And so we're always, we're always in this world of kind of underdetermination in which in individual cases of individual people, you can have intuitions, but on truly large scales, I'd be very hesitant to make any pronouncements.
I have two questions of Staff Sereda. Well, first, I would like to ask about something that was probably already asked, about the attempt of historian to understand and to communicate some meanings to a reader. There is this famous saying that the past is always a distant country. And in your attempts, so the question would be, in your attempts to understand and to communicate something to a reader, are you trying to communicate something about the distant region more, or about the distant time? To what extent is time distance is important in your approach? But the second question would be a typical question of an inhabitant of Lviv. Since the meeting is at the Center for Urban History, I specifically checked your first book about the references to Lviv, and Lviv figures a lot there, even topography of Lviv, streets of Lviv, and so on. But still, what place, in more general sense, Lviv had in the story you were dealing with? Was it only a place around 1936 for some meetings and encounters, or was it some challenge for the people you were dealing with? Would you see some place, I don't know, for groups like, I don't know, Communist Party of Western Ukraine, who are also dealing with this issue of Marxism against Stalinism in this broader picture, or not so? Just some question about local pride. So.
Okay, lots of different questions. The distant time and distant place. That's an excellent question, because of course they blend together. When I'm actually writing, I'm always in a distant time and a distant place. And I have often wondered how I would feel if I were writing about my own country but writing about the past. Because then you've controlled for the variable of place, but not for time. And I don't know. I can't completely answer that. I think to some extent, the past is always a foreign country. And I think my friends who are American historians of the United States would also feel a bit the same way, that it's still a very foreign place that they're going into when they're writing about the past. I know that, one of the exercises I did, again, back when I was a graduate student, had much more time. When I was working on my master's thesis, I was at University of Toronto. It was 1996, and I was writing about the Svaz Československých spisovatelů, the Czechoslovak Writers Union, and really a kind of group of writers from Kundera's generation. In the first 2 decades of the communist period, so more or less 48 to 68. It was a kind of a very linguistic project in some ways. I was trying to look at how they constructed a language of Stalinism for themselves and eventually how they got themselves out of that language, how they extricated themselves. And so I was reading a lot of literary text. I was reading poetry. I was reading speeches from Writers' Union meetings and protocols from those meetings. I was reading the literary press. But the other thing I did was I would go to the library in the morning and I would read, well, first of all, I stopped reading anything that was in English or that was being produced in Toronto or contemporaneously. I stopped reading the newspapers, I stopped listening to the radio, I stopped having any contact with the real world I was living in 1996. Toronto in 1996 I tried to push out of my brain, and instead in the morning I would go to the microfilm room at the University of Toronto Library, and I would read Rude Pravo, which was the big Communist Party daily in Czechoslovakia at the time. And I wasn't actually directly using any material from that, but I wanted to put in my mind what would be in my mind if I were actually living in Prague in 1952, and you know, this is like, and you wake up in the morning and you're making coffee and this is what you see, you know. And I did that as an exercise. And again, I had no other obligations at the time. I could not do that now. I mean, now I would have to, you know, communicate with, you know, my children's babysitter and with the preschool teacher. And but at this time, I could do it pretty much in an absolute sense. You know, I had 24 hours a day, all of which were mine, and I could totally immerse myself. And as an exercise, again, it's never 100%, but it was quite effective. I mean, there was a certain point at which I really felt like I was no longer living in Toronto in 1996, at which I really felt I had in some sense penetrated this foreign world. And it was only when I really felt inside that I felt ready to write. Now, whether it was inside a time or inside a place, I don't know. And that certainly is one of the challenges when I teach too. You know, how do you convey both time and place? I'll tell a brief anecdote that in fact, I may have already told you, but maybe I'll tell for the benefit of the rest of you. I was, several years ago, and I was maybe 10 years ago now, I was teaching at Indiana University. I was teaching a seminar on intellectuals and Marxism in Europe. And one of the books we read was Milan Kundera's novel. It's Žert in Czech. It's the joke in English. And which in some ways is a kind of existentialist, fictionalized autobiography from Kundera's own life. But the protagonist of the novel is this young man named Ludwig, who is a party member and a university student. And he's going to send a postcard to his girlfriend, or the girl he wants to be his girlfriend, while she's away at a Communist Party training seminar, you know, saying, "Long live Trotsky." And this will be the end of his life, basically. He will be thrown out of the party, he will be thrown out of the university, he will be sent to work in the mines, you know, and his whole life will turn on this postcard. And the student who was beginning the seminar, every seminar, one of the students was assigned to begin with a short presentation on the book we read, and the student who was presenting this book began the presentation, and he said, well, the main character's name is Ludwig, and he is a Communist Party member and a university student. And then one day, as a joke, he sends his girlfriend this email. and that was just a completely surreal moment to me, because nobody else in the class noticed. And it's not that they hadn't read the book. I mean, it was in their minds the postcard was somehow unconsciously, automatically transformed into an email, because, you know, who sends postcards? You would send an email. And I thought, wow, I'm trying to put them in Prague in 1952. You know, how do I actually project them into a world before email? I don't even remember a world before email. So yeah, the time and the place variable. Lviv. Yeah, Lviv is certainly a city I imagined a lot before I came here. And I came here for the first time in 2005. More or less right as I was finishing this book, you know, and I was really writing a book about Warsaw intellectuals, and Lviv for them was a kind of, which was Lviv at the time, of course, was a kind of cultural center and a place that some of them went. to do theater projects, to read their poetry. It was certainly part of a world, I think, that they saw as their world. And then it enters my book in this kind of scene-like way. You know, first in 1936, at this Congress of Intellectuals, in which Wanda Wasilewska plays the leading role. This Congress of left-wing intellectuals that's held here, in which for Wanda Wasilewska, this is the moment of the Popular Front. So it's the moment when the Soviet Union declares the Popular Front, and the communists and the Bundist and the socialists get together. So it's a kind of ecstatic moment, you know, for the people in my book. This is especially an ecstatic moment for Wanda Wasilewska. You know, Lviv is something completely, you know, what is Lviv for her? Completely amazing. It's also a kind of, I think, for people like Wasilewska or Broniewski, a kind of potential imagined paradise of interethnic harmony, the way they experience it during this Congress, that this is the case that shows us that in this left-wing paradise, or in this, you know, socialist paradise, we're working towards all of these ethnic tensions, and all of the anti-Semitism will melt into the air because now we're all going to live as brothers. And Lviv was very important for that reason. Because that Congress was here, it made them feel that way. And it put them in this, you know, it gave an additional element to their already kind of utopian world, and they thought this was the beginning of the new world. And then it, you know, comes into the book again in a much, much darker moment just 3 years later in 1939, because Lviv is where most of my main characters flee in September 1939. You know, and even the ones who very much were supportive of the Soviet Union, you know, and even the ones who had, you know, sat in Polish prison, you know, because they were communist or because they were fellow travelers. And several of them are like, first I should say, they're very excited to get themselves into prison. You know, when they manage to get themselves arrested, they're ecstatic. I mean, they're thrilled, and they get to be in the cell with real workers. And these are intellectuals who, I mean, they're contact with real workers. I mean, they had imagined these workers. They were always trying to speak to the workers, but really, they never spoke to any workers. They didn't have any common language with the workers. I mean, they were writing these kind of ridiculously abstruse, complicated, you know, polemics about what Marxist literary criticism should be that was inaccessible to anybody who hadn't, you know, also read a lot of German philosophy. And, and their contact with real workers comes when they get in a prison cell with the real worker, and then they write these very proud, ecstatic letters to their friends about how they're in a cell, and I'm in a cell with a worker, and the worker likes me, and I'm teaching the worker, and like they're pet fetishized workers, and they're very proud of this time in prison, you know, and that they have suffered on behalf of the revolution, and they're, you know, fantasizing about the Soviet project. And even the ones who are still fantasizing as late as 1939, they get here fleeing from the Nazis, of course, you know, fleeing from the German occupation, and they get here in September 1939. And, you know, of course, by the end of September, this is under, you know, Soviet occupation, and it takes them about 2 hours to be scared to death. You know, and then the book that Julian Strycholski writes, Wielki Strach, you know, the Great Fear, then that very much, Lviv for them is a place of terror. And that has a particular meaning to them because it's a city that they understood as a very European city, as a cosmopolitan city, as a literary city, you know, as a city of great architecture, you know, and then it becomes this site of terror. And that makes it particularly poignant for them. And that moment in the fall of, for most of the characters in my book, it's mainly the fall of 39, and for some of them it goes a bit into 1940 before they manage to get themselves now arrested by the Soviets. And then they're not ecstatic at all. And they were ecstatic to be arrested by the Poles, you know, and, but they're not ecstatic at all to be arrested by the Soviets. But this city that is then this is their experience of the Soviet Union. This becomes their first real experience of the Soviet Union. And of course they realized that it was nothing like they thought it was. It was even nothing like the ones who had visited on official visits that were kind of very carefully orchestrated by the Soviet government, like Broniewski. I mean, they had no idea what it was really going to be like. And it takes them about 2 hours to figure it out, and then they live in this state of terror. And the terror is particularly poignant because it's a place that they, in some sense, feel is their own. So yeah, I mean, I came here and I was first came here, 9 years ago, and I was around trying to find the restaurant where, their friend Władysław Daszewski sets up their arrest, by the Soviet secret police, and trying to find Wanda Wasilewska's villa, and, then I found the Hotel George, which was where Alexander Korneychuk, received the Polish writers as they came in. So for me, in that sense, it was a kind of weirdly nostalgic city because I had imagined it, having read the accounts about it. But certainly those few months in Lviv, for all of them, it was a biographical turning point. It was their first real experience of communism and power. In some sense, their whole lives turned on this experience.
Чи було питання?
В своїй другій книжці ви якраз описуєте свій перший візит до Львова. І моє враження, що ви описуєте цей перехід там з Польщі, Чехії, Центрально-Східної Європи до справжньої Східної Європи, де тінь тоталітаризму набагато глибша, темніша, люди не усміхаються, вони вдягаються в темні тони, чорний якийсь одяг. І там є прекрасна сцена, вулична сцена, якої ви стали свідком, коли люди хочуть рятувати кішку. І кінець кінців вони її рятують, але в процесі того вони не говорять одне з одним. Вони не проронили жодного слова. І тепер ви знову у Львові. І мене цікавить цей проміжок часу між 2005 роком і 2014. Як ви його собі бачите? Чи ви бачите, що Львів змінився, він віддаляється від того тоталітарного минулого? Чи може він насправді не дуже змінився? В принципі, ті самі люди з такими самими фізіономіями, жестами ходять навколо. І ви починаєте думати, що може ви щось важливе упустили тоді під час того свого першого візиту до Львова у 2005 році.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, first I got here 2 hours ago, so I haven't actually seen anything here yet. But actually, I've spent very, very little time here. I came here once, very briefly when I was doing some research in Kiev back in 2005. And my husband and I made a very brief weekend trip to Lviv, which was wonderful, and I loved it here. And then we were back for a week in 2007. The cat scene, I have to say, mesmerized me. It was again a situation in which I was thinking, Americans would not have saved the cat. I mean, maybe one of them individually. But you wouldn't have and people like your neighbors wouldn't have stopped what they were doing to save the cat. That really, everyone would have been too much in a hurry. And it would have been somebody's individual problem, or it would have been the cat's problem. And so, it's funny when for me the cat scene made a big impression, and I think people from Europe read it completely differently. Like, why are you telling the story about the saving of the cat? That was completely mesmerized. Maybe if I tell you this, it will help you understand my fascination with the cat story. Last year when I was where I normally live. This year I'm in Vienna, but I teach at Yale, which is in Connecticut, in a small city named New Haven. And so I was on campus. I was on the university campus. And I was walking from the library to the history department, which involves crossing, a semi-busy street, not a very busy street, but a semi-busy street between the library and the history department in the middle of the day in which many people were crossing the street. And as I started to cross the street, there was a blind woman, a young blind woman. She might have been a student, I don't know, who was kind of, walking with a cane. She was also crossing the street, but somehow she got confused, and misunderstood where she was going, or perhaps thought that, she was going to get into a car she was waiting for, but it wasn't the car. But somehow she got disoriented, and so instead of getting from one side of the street to the other side of the street, she somehow turned and then was walking kind of directly in the middle of the street towards this incoming traffic. Which was quite terrifying because she could have gotten hit by a car any moment. And there were lots of people around. There were students, there were professors, there were employees. There were lots of people around. and nobody went over to her to get her off the street. And I did, but I have to say I hesitated. You know, I hesitated for a minute before I went to her, you know, and tried to explain and get her to come with me to the other side of the street. And when I approached her apologetically. You know, it seemed to me like the first thing I did is say, I'm very sorry, you know, and I'm sorry to bother you, but I think, you know, and like, as if I mean, I felt like I was insulting her, or I was intervening in some way, in some sphere that I shouldn't be intervening in, because we live in a country of individualism in which people believe in private autonomy, you know, and so I felt very awkward about this. You know, but I tried to explain. I said, you know, you're kind of walking in the middle of the street. Can you just come with me, and I'll, you know, put you on the other sidewalk? And later on, you know, and 2 minutes later it was over, and I pointed her in the right direction, and she went on to the library, and, you know, as far as I know, she's safe today, and everything is fine. But later, I was kind of haunted by my own hesitation. Like, why was nobody stopping, and why did I hesitate, you know, before I helped her? I mean, it wasn't a calculation that, was it worth 2 minutes and 30 seconds of my time to potentially save somebody's life? You know, it was somehow something else. It was some kind of culture of individualism that says that you don't just approach strangers and maneuver them to some other place. You don't get involved in other people's lives that way, not on a regular basis. And for some reason, that scene haunted me for a long time. You know, my own hesitation in approaching this blind woman. And perhaps that explains a bit about why I was so captivated by the collective effort to save the cat, because it took quite a while to save this cat. I mean, there must have been, you know, 10 to 15 people donating 30 to 45 minutes of their time to save this cat, which was a kind of unbelievable scene to me. You know? I was quite fascinated by it. So yeah, no, I think people here read it differently, because the saving of the cat doesn't seem to have the same effect. But yes, no, and I have to say there's something about Lviv and that reminded me of Krakow in the 90s. You know, everything very beautiful but somehow run down. That was aesthetically very appealing. There's always something about the grayness of Warsaw that I always loved, that always kind of kept drawing me back. I don't know why that is. I think part of it is just an aesthetic inclination. You know, I think part of what draws me back is an aesthetic inclination. Something about it, you know, feels very appealing to me. You know, something about this city felt very appealing to me, although I can't say I know it at all, and I only spent a tiny bit of time here. And I'm sure a lot of it is what I've imagined from having, you know, read other writers writing about Lviv.
I have a trivial question about the titles of your books. So how do you come up with your titles? Caviar, Ashes, and these encounters in your memoir?
Yes, well, how I came up with the titles is, of course, lots of vacillating. It was never easy to come up with the titles. Caviar and Ashes, I wanted visual imagery. I wanted concrete imagery. The concrete was very important to me. One of the things that I wanted to do was, I felt like there had been a lot of sociological description about things like intellectuals and Marxism or generations, and I wanted to get beyond paradigms into the particular and the detailed. One of my two advisors, Sepp Gumbrecht, who's German, likes to talk about something he calls the vereinschissendes Detail, the kind of the detail that hits obliquely, which was often very concrete and visual. So I had a very strong sense about looking for something concrete and visual. And the image of caviar struck me because of the receptions at the Soviet embassy in Warsaw that lots of these writers would then write about. You know, once you become a kind of fellow traveler, in interwar Poland, you then get invited to these receptions, and they always talk about the caviar. And there was also something about the image of caviar I loved, the kind of the very brightly colored eggs. And I have to say, I can't stand caviar. I find it revolting. I find it repulsive in some way. But it's a particular. I find it as a particularly vivid image. It's also it was served at Bruno Yashensky's dinner party in Moscow, which is an important scene in the book. And Zepp, who always talks about the Kvarensches in this detail, he wanted to know. It was important for him to know what kind of caviar Bruno Yashensky was serving at that dinner party. And this is exactly the moment where I kind of wish I were a novelist and not a historian, because the sources available don't allow me to say what kind of caviar was served, because it has not been preserved in any of the accounts of that dinner party, and you can't make up details, unfortunately. Of course, if I were writing a novel, I would fill in those blank spaces that you can't fill in when you're a historian. So that's where the caviar came from. The ashes was very much overdetermined, and the ashes was above all the ashes of Warsaw. When my characters who survived the war returned to Warsaw. And there's a poem that Antoni Słonimski writes called Popiół during the war, thinking about Warsaw. Warsaw is burned to ashes. There's also the image from Popiół i Diament, the famous Andrzejewski novel, post-war novel and film, and it's an image that returns time and time again. So I wanted to get at images that would suggest that there was something concrete and narrative. And that's how the juxtaposition of images, because I felt like there was the juxtaposition of things that did not necessarily go together in these people's lives that I wanted to get across. The Taste of Ashes, the second title, that very particularly was inspired by the scene that opens the book. In which a friend of the man who has just killed himself actually reaches into the urn and tastes the ashes, and that stuck in my mind somehow. That desire to get, not just to see the ashes and push them away, but to taste them. That somehow it's like that communion with them that struck in my mind as an image. Encounters for the book that I'm working on now, which is completely unwritten. Called Phenomenological Encounters. That comes from Józef Tischner, Spotkania in Polish. And Tischner is inspired very much by Levinas. And it's this idea that there's something about the moment of encounter between individuals that Tischner says initiates a drama, the course of which cannot be foreseen. And what I want to do is write a book that's less about influence in a kind of abstract history of idea sense and more about actual encounters among thinkers and their relationships. But the title, there's no real methodology. I'm waiting for something to strike me. I'm waiting for something to seem interesting.
Я послухав, я взагалі не думав говорити, мені все дуже сподобалося, але така тільки ремарка до того, що ви останнім сказали, щодо назви книжки, де є присутня ікра, то оскільки ви писали про лівих інтелектуалів, ви писали про марксистів і так далі, то у 20-х, особливо в 30-х роках було дуже популярно серед лівої інтелігенції, з лівими переконаннями, з комуністичними переконаннями, ходити на різного роду прийняття в радянське консульство у Львові, і їх називали ікроїдами. Їх там завжди пригощали ікрою, незважаючи на те, що в радянській Україні був голод але дуже багато такої української інтелігенції лівої ходили туди на ці прийняття і дуже із задоволенням споживали. Так що це такий, бачите, ви львівського досвіду не знали, а назвали так дуже влучно свою книжку. Дякую.
Thank you.
Я думаю, напевно, вже час на останнє запитання. Які ваші плани на майбутнє? так коротко, над чим ви зараз працюєте, і чи цікава вам ця частина, ще східніша Європи, і чи не хочете ви посунутися на сучасну територію України?
Well, first I should say that, I mean, for me it doesn't feel so, moving east doesn't feel so dramatic, because I did research for my first book in Russia as well, and I made various trips to Moscow, to Petersburg, to Kiev. Wanda Wasilewska ends up in Kiev. She marries Alexander Korneychuk. These Polish writers, end up at various points in the Soviet Union. So you have to follow your characters, So I was always following my characters. East or wherever else they happen to be. I spent a really lovely day once in Kiev, or outside of Kiev, at Wanda Wasilewska's dacha that she used to live in with Alexander Korneychuk. There was this very, very nice cab driver that I met outside a cafe. I was trying to figure out how I could get there. Must have been 2002. It was 2002. And there was a young cab driver in a cab outside a cafe, and he didn't look like he had that much to do, or other customers, so I thought maybe I could negotiate with him, and pay him to drive me all the way outside of the city to the dacha. And he agreed, so I ended up, spending the day with him. It was a kind of drive out to the dacha, and then when we got to the dacha, he said, oh, he'll wait in the car for me. But then somehow we were already kind of friendly from having, talked on the way to the dacha. And I was like, oh, no, you should come in. Why would you wait in the car? Kind of, it might be interesting. And he took such a great interest. He was a student at the Technical University. He was studying engineering or something like that. But he took such a great interest, and he was asking all these very good questions to the curator there, who also then assumed that we were married, and he was my husband, and he must be a kind of my husband who's trying to introduce his American wife to Ukrainian culture, and that's why we're here. We're trying to introduce the live. And she was so nice to us because she was so pleased by this situation. I mean, I was so grateful to him. That was what was my Russian was much better, so I was speaking to him in Russian. In any case, it doesn't feel so exotic to move east, I should say, for better or for worse. What does feel, what I'm much more wary about is, as a historian, I am always afraid to write about the present. And I certainly don't like to make predictions about the future. My last book just came out in German translation, and the publication of the German translation in February, of course, coincided with the Maidan. And so all of these German journalists interviewing me, wanted me to tell them what was going to happen in Ukraine. And I just keep trying to explain. Even if something were happening in Poland, historians are very bad at telling you what's going to. Sometimes my husband knows what's going to happen, but I never know what's going to happen. In the best case, historians can figure out what already happened, and even then, not always. Sometimes we still can't figure it out. But, at least we're working with something happened, and can we empirically piece all those, find all those puzzle pieces together. I never know what's going to happen in the future, and I'm always very nervous about commenting on the present when you don't have those godlike, omniscient advantages of being a historian where you get to see all the pieces better than the actors do. In the present, you don't really have the same kind of advantage over the participants that you do when in retrospect, writing about things that are already happened. You as a historian have a huge advantage over the people who were the actual subjects and the actual actors. In real time, that advantage is not very great. And so I'm always very, very wary about writing about anything in the present. It is impossible not to be captivated. I try never to write about contemporary politics. I'm not qualified. I don't understand them well enough. My mind is always somewhere else. the time when everything was happening on the Maidan in February, I was working on research about the Polish philosopher Roman Ingarden and his relationship with Edith Stein and with Vitkacy, as they played out in the 1920s and 1930s, and my mind was completely someplace else. But it was impossible somehow not to pay attention. Perhaps because there were people I knew out there in the Maidan, or there were friends of my friends there, or it's not a world that feels very foreign and alien to me. It's not a world I would say I know very well because I've spent relatively little time in Kiev, but it's not a world that feels alien. It's a world that somehow feels accessible. And everything was live streamed on YouTube, and you could watch this all in real time, and that was extraordinary. I mean, to me, the idea that you could actually watch what was happening in real time, and you could, I mean, there was a moment at which I could feel as if kind of palpably, that people had made a decision, and they were willing to die there if necessary. And that was like, I could feel it as if something, as if something turned, as if you could hold it, and that was unbelievable. And it was impossible not to stop what I was doing and pay attention to something like that. And then then coming back to your question about the responsibility of a historian, then I really started thinking about the fact that, well, Americans really didn't understand this. They have no point of access into this. There's a lot, there was a lot of talk about language politics, which didn't feel intuitively very real to me, maybe for very, subjective reasons. I mean, I felt like there was a kind of tendency, among Americans to think that, well, if they're Ukrainian speakers, then they're probably nationalist and don't deserve our support, and if they're Russian speakers, well, then they're Russians, and, with respect to Russian, there's never been human rights in Russia, and we kind of throw up our arms, it's hopeless, what can we do? And then there was talk about, there was this feeling that, well, nothing multilingual this way could possibly be held together, which from a historian's point of view is completely ahistorical. The perceived normativity of monolingualism is a kind of modern curiosity. I mean, like, as someone who thinks about the past, that, in fact, these are, multilingualism was historically, in huge parts of the world, the rule and not the exception. And there were also things I felt intuitively. Like I was in Kiev. The last time I was in Kiev with my husband, and he speaks Ukrainian but not Russian, and I was speaking Russian but not Ukrainian, and we were just speaking what we knew. I studied Russian and he studied Ukrainian, and I could understand, some Ukrainian from the Polish and the Czech and the Russian, but I don't speak it. And he can understand quite a bit of Russian, but he doesn't speak it. And so when people in Kiev were trying to speak to both of us together, these were I say everyone from, unless they spoke Polish, in which case they switched to Polish, which we both speak, everyone from the waiters at the cafe, to writers and intellectuals, kept switching back and forth to try to accommodate us. And of course, this was, it was a slightly difficult situation for us because, my Russian was rusty. I'm trying to immerse myself in Russian so I can remember it again. So when people switch in and out of Russian, that makes it harder. But it wasn't a problem for them. Like, I felt intuitively it wasn't really a problem for them. Like, everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable, And so then when you start, when you get a sense that Americans don't understand what's going on, and they think that if there are two languages, something is going to break up because that's an impossible state of tension that could never be maintained, and these people aren't really real to them because there's no real point of connection. And then I started feeling like I wanted, I wanted to do something, or I felt like I should do something, or maybe it's a moment where potential cultural interpreters have a role to play. And I'm not a political scientist. There's certainly political scientists who have kind of stepped up with predictions about what Putin's going to do and what the effect of sanctions will be. And I haven't commented about that because I don't understand it well enough. I mean, to really understand geopolitics, you have to understand economies. And I fundamentally don't understand economy well. You have to understand math. I've always been very bad at math. So I haven't commented on that at all, but I felt like there were certain things I did understand. Like I very, very quickly in February, I stopped following the American coverage and I started following Gazeta Wyborcza instead in Poland. Wyborcza had a live feed, and I thought the coverage was much better. And then I could see that there were things Poles understood intuitively about Ukraine that Americans couldn't pick up at all, and I became then, and then of course I was hearing from my Polish friends who were talking about this constantly, and writing to me and saying we should go and you should go, and then I started thinking about, could I do something? Was I confident to do something? And then I started turning around this idea that, well, maybe I could write about people. Maybe what I like to do is write about people. What I've always done mostly is write about intellectuals, that it's a kind of way about writing about ideas, but writing about ideas in embodied form. And of course, it's very convenient to write about intellectuals because intellectuals write, so it expands your source base significantly. I think there are many people that I think who are not intellectuals at all who I think would be fascinating to write about. If you could get enough sources. And I think if you could stay in some place like the anthropologist for really long periods of time and rely exclusively on on interviews or something like that, you could get a much different kind of population sample. But what I think I could do was I could write some longer portrait some longer essay than has generally been published in the States about people from subjective role in the Ukrainian revolution, what they're looking for, what they were hoping for, why they were making certain decisions, how their friends were reacting, how their families were reacting. I thought there was maybe I have some possibility of telling a more human story than has thus far been done, and telling a story that's about ideas, and about politics on the level of ideas and the level of hopes, but also telling a story that's more about individuals, which is what I like to do. And I vacillated a lot because I thought, well, I have 2 small children and I can't really leave them for a long time and go to Ukraine, but I kept thinking that this was important and that maybe this is where I should be.
Ми будемо чекати тоді на вашу історію нашої революції і дякуємо вам за просто надзвичайно цікаву зустріч. Нам було дуже цікаво, дуже приємно. І ми дуже сподіваємося, що це не остання зустріч і ви ще до нас приїдете. Дуже дякую.